Hey.
Stations, everyone.
Little clicker, hang on. Good morning, everybody. It's good to be with y'all. I hope everybody's doing well. What a great, big, wonderful crowd we had this morning. That is awesome. I want to let you know that I am going to be out next Sunday. I'm going with some youth and parents to Houston. We're going to stay at the treehouse at the cathedral. We're going to do some mission work on Saturday. So, but I can't wait. Sorry, it's going to be good. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, all right. So we have, we're going to continue with our study of the screw tape letters, and today I think might have 2 classes worth of content, but I'll do we'll just go as far as we can go and we'll see what happens. We have so moderation, the golden mean, and the middle way. So this lesson is really kind of looking at C.S. Lewis's encouragement of kind of moderation in a lot of different things, and how that could be perhaps seen as a virtue itself. The introduction to there are 2 introductions. There's an introduction that he writes to the 1941 edition of the Screwtape Letters, and there's another edition that he writes in 1961. And from the introduction in 1941, he starts by saying, "I have no intention of explaining how the correspondence which I now offer to the public fell into my hands. There are 2 equal and opposite errors into which our race can fall about the devils. One is to disbelieve in their existence. The other is to believe and to feel an excessive and unhealthy interest in them. They, the devils themselves, are equally pleased with both errors and hail a materialist or a magician with the same delight." I think that's just a great and fascinating little there. So Lewis seems to be saying there are 2 errors. One is to kind of discount or denial that temptation and the things that lead us astray aren't real and don't exist. And then the other error is to be overly focused on that aspect. So one way the simplest way of talking about that is to say that don't pay the devils too much attention, right? You give your power away when you do that. Moderation and belief. Devils, demons, tempters exist, but God is where our proper focus belongs. So in terms of, so of course you can't, there are moments when spiritual warfare or praying in that way is very appropriate. But there are folks who become overly fixated on that. And then from that, they tend to see the entire world in terms of kind of a battle. And shalom, which is, the peace that passes all understanding. I don't believe that God wants us to live in a state of that kind of anxiety all the time, or to feel embattled our whole lives. And yet, right, to pretend that they're not there is an equal and opposite error, right? And so there is this fine balance that one is trying to attain. The second thing is, I thought it might be helpful to talk about materialists or materialism, as well as magician. He uses those terms throughout the book quite a bit, and I think they're interesting. So materialists, right, or materialism, the only thing that is really and truly real is the material, what is physical. There is no supernatural, there's just the material. And so there isn't a soul, there's a brain and neurotransmitters, right? There isn't, God doesn't exist in that framework. The only thing that's real is what you can kind of prove and by sort of breaking things down into their component parts. We'll get into a little more about this a little later, but of course, science sort of, the Enlightenment sort of leads us into this kind of materialist understanding or philosophy. But then science keeps going, and of course, then they discover that it's a particle and a wave, and then you've got string theory and quantum physics, and all of these other kinds of scientific discoveries that really question this materialism. So materialism itself is sort of debunked now, and yet vestiges of this way of thinking really remain. Okay. The other is the magician. The supernatural exists for the magician, and these forces can be manipulated by human beings to create a desired result. So that is conjuring, that is, so magic is different than prayer, right? And I'll get to that in a little bit more. But the magician is really tuned into the invisible realm, if you will. The difference is that the locus of control is within the human being, not with God. Y'all track me so far? Okay. Then, this is from the 1961 edition, this little piece of his description of hell. So we talked about devils a little bit. Now let's talk for a second about hell. This is Lewis's definition. We must picture hell as a state where everyone is perpetually concerned about his own dignity and advancement, where everyone has a grievance, and where everyone lives the deadly, serious passions of envy, self-importance, and resentment. Thought that was a very good definition. You know, I believe Lewis is the one who has that, when he talks about hell, and he always uses an analogy. And he says that, in hell, there's a bus, ready to take you to heaven all the time. You can get on the bus, no one's gonna prevent you from getting on the bus, but that, no one gets on the bus, because they argue the whole time about who's gonna get on the bus first. And so they're so stuck in this kind of grievance, resentment, their own position, that they are not able to kind of, to answer the invitation to become part of the life of God. Then the 1961 edition, after the Screwtape Letters have been around for 20 years, he talks about how they end up, the book ends up in everyone's guest room. It's very funny. But then he says, of course, people ask him a lot of times these questions. And so the question that people often ask is, do you believe in the devil? And he says, now, if by the devil you mean a power opposite to God and, like God, self-existent from all eternity, the answer is certainly no. God has no opposite. No being could attain a perfect badness opposite to the perfect goodness of God. For when you have taken every kind of good thing, intelligence, will, memory, energy, existence, there would be none of the devil left. So the next question, he then says, is the proper question is whether I believe in devils, plural. I do. Let's go back one slide here and just talk a little bit about the Christian theology around God versus evil and all that. So there's a little bit of one of the best things I ever heard is, you can't make evil make sense because evil doesn't make sense. Because God is the ultimate sense maker. And so evil in a sense doesn't make sense. And so we want to either try to put evil on the God side of the equation, like make God responsible for evil, Or we do this dualism where we think that we've got, that the devil is kind of equal to God, which the devil is not, right? God is, if immortal, invisible, God only wise, that hymn, right, it's description, right? So God is, the creator, creation ex nihilo, God is not created, God exists. And everything else God creates, including the angels. And so in the, it's a little bit in scripture and it's in the tradition of the church, but you have kind of this angelology kind of, and then the Nicene Creed, when we talk about the sensible realm and the invisible realm, right? You have the ethereal, the mind, the higher level of reality, and then you have the material reality, physical reality. And they're kind of bifurcated in that kind of ancient cosmology. And human beings are the belly button of the cosmos. We live in both realms. We are both in the intelligible realm, the realm that we can intellige, the realm of love, the realm of ideas, the realm of all that is there that we can with our reason and minds enter into, and yet we're also part of the physical realm. And so the early church fathers imagined us as this belly button of the cosmos. We link both ways. So our job is to translate the gifts of heaven and the ethereal realm into the created order, into the physical order. And we are also to take the needs and the issues of the physical and material realm and lift them up into the heavenly realm. So we're a bridge. Angels are created beings. They are created by God. And they are the pure intelligences, created non-corporeal beings. So they are real and exist, but they don't have a material or physical form. Does that make sense? You do not have to believe in angels. You do not want to. I'm just saying, this is the backstory here. We'll get to that here in just a second. So God creates the angels. And as we know, right, the Lucifer, he falls, right, of his own free will, or her, they're non-gendered, these angels, but anyway, Lucifer falls, Lucifer means light, he's like prettiest angel or whatever, and Lucifer falls. And so like our free will, there are angels who have determined, not to be a part of what God is doing, to not participate in the life of God. And so Satan or Lucifer is not the opposite of God, but of Michael, of the Archangel Michael. That is a better cohort. In Dante's Inferno, the ninth circle of hell is frozen. Do y'all remember that? And the devil's feet are frozen in the ice, and his wings are going. He's stuck there. His wings keep going, and the wings, of course, keep everything frozen. And so there is a way in which everything that is created by God. And so in some sense, even this ninth circle, right, that in some sense, God's love in a way won't allow him to just disappear and not exist. He's gonna keep existing and keep his existence going through this flapping, but he never completely disappears. Does that and I don't know if that makes sense at all, but that's Dante's Inferno. So that's one way of thinking about kind of the existence of evil, and this kind of dark side of what there is. And the other thing that C.S. Lewis says in his introduction in 1981 is, I believe this not in the sense that it is a part of my creed, but as an opinion. My religion would not be in ruins if this opinion were shown to be false, right? This is not a deal breaker. This is not in the Nicene Creed, angels, devils, etc., right? This is a very mature Christian saying, you know what, this is, I think, this is a very helpful way to imagine and to, gain some, insight into what it's like to be a human being with these things happening. And so this is his opinion, his belief. And yet if this belief crumbled, it wouldn't kill him, right? And so there's a lot of that in our faith and C.S. Lewis. And as we mature in our faith, you know, we often put God in a box that's too small, you know, and then our life experience causes that box to break open, and it can be very disconcerting, right, when that happens. And but then eventually we kind of get into a deeper and newer understanding, we mature in our faith and our understanding of what's happening. So I'm going to throw in a quote by Verna Dozier. She wrote a book called The Dream of God, but I will believe the best I can discern today. Tomorrow I may find out I was wrong. Since I do not live by being right, I am not destroyed by being wrong. I live by the life of God. Doubt is not the opposite of faith. Fear is. Fear will not risk that even if I am wrong, I will trust that if I move today by the light that is given to me, knowing it is only finite and partial, I will know more and different things tomorrow than I know today, and I can be open to the new possibility I cannot even imagine today. So this is an aspect of our faith that's very Anglican, which is that we enter into, we just have a lot of humility about what we know and what we don't know. And because we are in relationship with a loving God, we know that our understandings are going to change and develop over time. Okay. All right, so table discussion. We have activities. So in what ways do you imagine equal and opposite errors of denial and preoccupation, so denial that devils exist versus preoccupation, might impact a person? What would be the impact of those two things? Have the ideas offered thus far challenged you or given you a different insight? Which ones? And Lewis makes a distinction between beliefs of creed and opinion. If you have one, tell about the experience of having one of your beliefs about spiritual things change or evolve over time, if you're willing to share. Okay, I'm gonna keep these up and invite you to introduce yourselves to the people at your table and enter into just a little bit of conversation about, I know you don't have to answer all these questions in 7 minutes, but kind of pick one that interests you and engage in, as you'd like to. Okay, all right. Enjoy. So anything from your table that you want to share with the larger group? Maybe you don't have to, but just as you were talking, something really interesting came up, you want to share with everybody, just raise your hand. Share with the larger group. That's okay. Given the time, I'm going to skip the entire next section of my presentation to get to the other section. But there is, so this class is really focused on chapter 7 in the book. And he talks about, when we talked about the materialist and the magician. And this chapter he talks about the materialist magician would be the perfect thing. Because then you have people that believe in that they forces and lots of woo-woo, but they don't actually have faith in God, right? And so it's like, so it's like if, I don't know, and I think we're kind of there, we actually have materials, magicians now. You can sort of see it in like a really big focus on, you can see it in kind of new agey stuff, but you can also see it in, it's easier for people to believe in aliens than it is for them to believe in God. And yeah.
Scientists, I think we kind of like scientists.
Yeah, it's like when science kind of gets a little wonky, like, yeah, it's sort of this, the other thing that's really is material, the materialist, and this will come up in the part I am gonna teach about, is we start pulling things apart, we start breaking things down to their component parts to learn about them. It's not bad. We figure out cell structure, we figure out diseases are caused by bacteria, there's a lot of good things about the enlightenment, let's not write it completely off, but we get really hyper-focused on origins, right? Like what is the cause? Like if we can break it down into small enough pieces, then you can kind of figure it out. And we stop asking the question, what is it for? So you can't understand a human being just by knowing all of its components, right? You have to know what the human being is for, right? And as it is with many, many other things. So the kind of telos, which is direction or aim, what we're going for, the end, that piece of our understanding is not really part of what we talk about anymore culturally. We more talk about, you're a little crazy because your mom was a little crazy, or you're this, we want to kind of go back this way and try to figure out, what it is. And there is a place for that. However, if that's the only thing that we're doing, if all we're doing is deconstructing and not imagining what we are for, then we run into problems. So I'm going to skip all the materialism stuff, but it's interesting. I'll do it another time. But I'll read this last quote just as. The materialist magician dabbles with beauty and truth, but refuses to embrace its wonder and its maker. Uses magic as a machine to achieve selfish political ends, and even replaces the vision of restored humanity into a life of flawless and naked ambition. So it's perfectly ready to access the spiritual realm, but never to believe in it, if that makes sense. So now I'm going to get to the part that will to be continued. We'll go back to the materialist magicians later, but I want to read from chapter 7. This is I had not forgotten my promise to consider whether we should make the patient, remember that's what they call the person they're working on, an extreme patriot or an extreme pacifist. All extremes, except extreme devotion to the enemy, are to be encouraged. Not always, of course, but at this period. Some ages are lukewarm and complacent, and then it is our business to soothe them fast or asleep. Other ages, of which one is the present, are unbalanced and prone to faction, and it is our business to inflame them. It's pretty good. Then it goes, I'm just going to read the whole thing. It's going to go on for a little bit here. Yeah. So, any small coterie bound together by some interest which other men dislike or ignore tends to develop inside itself a hothouse of mutual admiration, and towards the outer world a great deal of pride and hatred, which is entertained without shame, because the cause is its sponsor and it is thought to be impersonal. Even when the little group exists originally for the enemy's own purposes, like church, this remains true. We want the church to be small, not only for fewer men to know God, but also that those who do may acquire the uneasy intensity and defensive self-righteousness of a secret society or clique. The church itself is, of course, heavily defended, and we've never quite succeeded, but subordinate factions within her have often produced admirable results, from the parties of Paul and Apollos at Corinth down to the high and low parties of the Church of England. So far he's saying that divide and conquer, right? That this is like getting people into factions is really helpful for the devil. A hothouse of mutual admiration, isn't that great? And towards the outer world, a great deal of pride and hatred, which is entertained without shame. Remember, we talked about, anyway, well, yeah, I'm gonna keep going. If your patient can be induced to become a conscientious, it goes on to say alcohol. If he can become a conscientious objector and a pacifist, that's great, because a lot of people are gonna think he's a terrible person if he does that. But if he does that like out of a real sense of integrity, then it's not gonna work out so well for you, right? If he's doing it because really he's kind of a coward, and he just doesn't want to fight, it'll work out great. But if he's actually doing it because he thinks it's the wrong thing to do, then it won't work. Your best plan, if that's the case, if he really is a man of integrity, would be to attempt a sudden, confused, emotional crisis from which he emerges as an uneasy convert to patriotism. Such things can often be managed, but I take him to be someone who get him to be a pacifist. So remember, this is World War II. This is the bifurcation that we're talking about, the partisanship that we're talking about in that movement. Just fast forward right now, think about partisanship. Whichever he adopts, your main task will be the same. Let him begin by treating the patriotism or the pacifism as a part of his religion. Then let him, under the influence of a partisan spirit, come to regard it as the most important part of his religion. So what do y'all think about that so far? Right? I mean, I think indictment is to be had on all sides here. And then quietly and gradually nurse him onto the stage at which the religion becomes merely part of the cause, in which Christianity is valued chiefly because of the excellent arguments it can produce in favor of either war or peace. So using our religion to justify our frame of reference, right? Our already established worldview. Can y'all think of that happening anywhere? Chanel, geez. So that is like, I just thought this was, that is really a terrible danger for us when we get kind of moved into that. And I can see that in all different kinds of ways happening, on the left, on the right, and on everything in between, right? Where people get very invested in their point of view, and then they sort of, the Bible is used to legitimize slavery, for example, right? I mean, we know that you can make an argument from scripture for a lot of things that we don't generally think of as what God intends for us. The attitude that you want to guard against is that in which temporal affairs, things that are happening in time, are treated primarily as material for obedience. So what the devil doesn't want to have happen, what the devils don't want to have happen, is for you to recognize in real time in your real life, right, that everything that's happening is raw material for you to obey God, to, in all things that are happening, to go to God and say, what would you have me do in this circumstance? And if you were here for Anthony's class last week, and you remember he talked about the desire of the devils to keep the virtues way out there in the fantasy, right? In the very far out from where we actually live, right? I'm for peace and I'm for whatever, and I'm for all these good things. They're way, way out there. But in the person's actual real life is where the vices need to be enacted, right? That's where they're not caring for their neighbor, they're not doing what they need to do, they're not actively engaged in loving their neighbor. And this is kind of the same thing, right? You see this when we push out our values, but we don't ever actually have to do anything with them, if that makes sense. So once you have made the world an end, not God, and faith is a means to get the world that you want, not a means to be in union with God. You have almost won your man, and it makes very little difference what kind of worldly end he is pursuing, provided that meetings, pamphlets, policies, movements, causes, and crusades, and I added Facebook and Instagram posts, matter more to him than prayers and sacraments and charity, the real life loving of neighbors, than he is ours. The more religious on those terms, the more securely ours. I could show you a pretty cage full down here, is the last sentence. Right, I just think that it's really brilliant, and I think we all need to kind of wrestle with this. I mean, I'm condemned as well, right, in terms of we project outward, our causes, right? And we think we've checked the virtue box. But virtue is the habits, practices, and dispositions and the enactments of virtue in real life with real people. So this moderation in extremes is also a piece that we want to talk about. So virtue ethics, Aristotle and Aquinas, and we're already at 10:45. 9:45. The idea that extremes are not great, it can be found in the virtue ethics of Aristotle. And then those are picked up by Aquinas. Aquinas shapes them a little bit differently. But Aristotle begins with, supposedly Aristotle, he was very handsome. Aristotle begins asking the question, what is good? What is the good, right? And ethics is like the study of the good, right? It's what is best for human beings and for the world. He insists that ethics is not just a theoretical kind of conversation. It doesn't just exist in sort of universal obvious truths out there, but that it needs to be embodied, enacted. We're asking what the good is, not simply because you want to have knowledge of what the good is, but because you want to actually be able to achieve the good. And if we develop further understanding of what it is to be good, then we will flourish. He's not looking for a list of what is good, right? Because in some ways it's not possible. He is searching for a good that is the highest good, and he uses a word, eudaimonia, right, which means happiness. It is the word that Thomas Jefferson is referring to in the Declaration of Independence. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The happiness in that one is not like, I don't know, balloons or unicorns. The happiness is about a much richer understanding of that word happiness. Eu means well, healthy, whole. Daimon means divinity or spirit. So well-spirited, right? Fulfilled, flourishing, right? This is the purpose of human life, according to Aristotle, right? We're meant to achieve this wellness of being and this flourishing. So he says, so that is our end, that is our task, right? Anyway, so that is our task. And then, well, how do we get toward that flourishing? How do we move toward that end of well-being and flourishing for human beings? And he says that that virtue is how we get there, right? And virtue, for Aristotle is the golden mean, which I'll show you a picture of in just a second. It is a moderate position between two extremes. Virtues are usually found in a balance. And Aquinas will kind of push against that a little bit, but not completely. And then reward, or the outcome of this, if one is virtuous and behaves in a virtuous way, the outcome that one will receive is you move closer to this telos, and this end that you're, this eudaimonia, that you're this happiness, this fulfillment that you're working towards. The whole society is then impacted and is working toward that as well. And so there's a sense of fulfillment or completion, and that muscle to do that virtue is strengthened in the act of doing it. So the more virtue you practice, the more virtuous you become. The other thing is that that's one of the ways in which you acquire virtue. That acquired piece is also very important because it's like you might come with some innate gifts or whatever, but the way to become a virtuous person is to hang out with other virtuous people, is essentially what Aristotle says. He's very interested in friendship. He's interested in community and how we help, and how people help one another learn to do the right thing. The other thing that's really important about Aristotle's view of ethics is that it's not a list of rules, like it would be sort of in deontological ethics, or duty ethics. Out of a sense of duty, one does things, although duty is handy. I'm a big fan of duty. But basically that there are too many complicated circumstances in life to have a rule for every situation, right? That in fact, there might be two right things to do in a situation, right? Or it may be, picking the least wrong one, right? But how will a person be able to do that? Well, if they have acquired the virtues, right? We have formed a human being who is capable by using rational thought, their spirit and their emotion integrated in harmony. That's another piece of Aristotle. That integrated harmonious human has these virtues that they've acquired over time, and in a circumstance, they will be able to make a good decision, a decision for the good, for the flourishing of themselves and other human beings. So that's virtue ethics, as opposed to deontological ethics, which is Kant, right? Which is universal truths, and it's more like a set of rules. And then you have quandary ethics, which is a modern thing, and that's more like the trolley car experiment or things like that. Saying like it's trying to give you an answer. Aristotle's essentially saying you can't have enough answers for things. What you have to have is people who are formed and capable of making good decisions. Does that make sense? Okay. So his habit or disposition is how we get there. So our habits, our practices and habits help us develop these. They help shape the disposition as well. And they're enacted. But there is, when a person has acquired the virtues, we can think about the virtues as this golden mean, as it is commonly called. So what you have here is sort of a middle ground between two extremes. So integrity is the right point between corruption and legalism. Courage is the right point between cowardness and sort of foolhardiness, right? That kind of recklessness. I mean, you're not brave, you're just too dumb to realize it's a bad idea. That's not good, right? But neither is the cowardice. Respect would be, on the one hand, disregard. on the other hand, idolatry, worshiping, or whatever it is. Love, selfishness, the other extreme might be enablement. Diligence would set between laziness and sloth and workaholism. Discernment would be between foolishness and judgmentalism, right? So you all get the idea here. There's kind of this middle way. And any questions so far about?
Can you talk about enablement as the extreme of love?
Well, I think that, I mean, also, I think this is not strictly Aristotle. I think this is like a development of Aristotle's idea, but I think that would, the enablement would be, like, I think it's a word that we get a lot from, recovery work and addiction ministry, which is like when you are enabling another person because you think you're loving them to continue on with that unhealthy or destructive behavior. You enable them, I'll tell you that. But you mistakenly think that it's love, and it probably comes from a place of love. You're not sure what to do or how to help them, and so you enable them. Okay, so any questions so far? So virtue ethics is the probably the preferred ethical frame of Christian ethics. Because we have a very strong commitment to this idea of formation, of character formation, of people formation. We're being formed into disciples of Christ. We hang out with other disciples of Christ who help us get better at being disciples of Christ. We're working on developing these internal virtues, but there's some differences between Aristotle and Aquinas and kind of how Christians understand virtue ethics. And so I just want to point those out really quickly. Aquinas says that love is the form of all virtue, that all virtue comes from love. He also says that that participation in the life of God, that is to be in friendship or relationship with God. Man is more than a composite of body and soul. He is nothing less than elevated to the supernatural order which participates as far as the human creature can in the nature of God, right? So our faith tells us that we actually are swept up into the life of God through the power of the Holy Spirit. We get a little foretaste of that heavenly kingdom right here, right now. And accordingly, a person in a state of grace or divine friendship with God possesses certain enduring powers, the infused virtues and gifts that raise him into an orbit that gives him ability of thought and operation that are literally born, not of the will of the flesh or the will of man, but of God. Right? That God gives you gifts, the Spirit gives gifts to those, and helps those virtues and gifts develop. Anyway, so the infused virtue, which some people seem to possess, I mean, you know, people that are just, right? That are just so, they're holy. You're around them and you're like, man, like they possess this incredible gift of all of kindness, courage, of whatever it is. They're gifts from God, and they're not solely the result of human effort, right? So for Aristotle, you just hang around with the right people, you're gonna get them, right? But the source of our virtue, some of it we could achieve on our own, right? But the source of this kind of enduring virtue really is from God. And then additionally, for Aquinas, virtue is a good habit bearing on it. So virtue is a habit bearing on activity. So it is like a muscle that you exercise, right? Because it's a habit, it's an ability, right? And then when the time comes to practice it in a new or in a challenging way, you have it available to you to put into action, right? That's a lot of what the ascetical practices Lent are all about, right? It's like exercising your muscles of self-control when you like fast yourself something. You're reminding yourself that you can not be driven by your appetites, that you could drive your own bus and not be compelled to do things that you decided that you don't want to do. And that is really valuable to know that you have that strength so that when like a real life thing comes up where you're gonna have to resist something, you know you have the muscle to resist it. Does that make sense? So, anyway, so that, so telos and end, our end, Aristotle talked about this flourishing, this happiness is our end, our aim, and the good of everybody. Those are all wrapped up in Aquinas, but the ultimate end, right, is union with God. It's this, that's it. And so there's a slight change, or understanding of what that is. All right, we're at 10, so we should probably stop now. But we can talk more about that as we go along. But as we heard in chapter 7, the extremes, right, the partisanship, all of that. I just thought this was a really good kind of corrective for us to try to imagine what would it look like to be a little more middle way with our neighbors, with one another, and how can we not cast our virtue far out there, but pull our virtues in close so that we're actually caring for and loving people that are right here. Does that make sense? Or, you know, right here. Maybe even a little bit there. But you know what I'm saying? Not just in the interways. All right, go in peace and I'll see y'all upstairs in just a bit.
What happened?
What?